Today, I want to talk about a subject that you hear constantly from the first time you get into Taijiquan, but it's seldom ever defined carefully, and that is the idea of root or rootedness. Unfortunately, we can't really get into the details of it until we clear up a couple of linguistic problems, just in terms of the definition of the word. You've got two completely different meanings of the word root. One is that it's the source of something, and it can be used very metaphorically in that sense, like the roots of music or the root of his behavior, something like that. It can also be thought of as we look at a plant and you say, oh, it comes from its roots. It actually comes from its seed, and the roots grow down and the branches grow up. But anyway, it looks like it comes from its roots. So that's the reference there. Things will go easier for you in Taijiquan if you realize that nowhere in the actual lexicon of real Taijiquan, certainly not in the classics, is the word root ever used in this way. Even when it seems to be. There's a very famous, aphorism that says the internal force is rooted in the feet, transmitted by the legs, directed by the waist, manifested in the fingers. This really sounds like it's telling you that this is coming from the feet. And we will get into that later. But just for the moment, just realize this is a mistaken interpretation of this classic. So just trust me that when we talk about root in Taijiquan, we are not referring to the source of anything. What we're referring to is the other idea of a root, which is that it's something fixed, it's fastened in the ground perhaps, or it acts like it's fastened in the ground. Even in this case, you have two possible meanings of that. In one case, something that's rooted means it's really hard to move itself. Like a tree is hard to move because it's rooted. But in the other case, you can say, well, it's rooted because it has some kind of fixed point that it can pull itself towards or push itself away from. This is the other meaning of root. Now, to understand this, let's think of a ship and the word anchor. The anchor can be used to keep the ship in one place. But also you can throw the anchor out, hook it on something, and then reel it in order to move the ship to another place. So this word root can be used in either of these two ways. In my personal sort of terminology, I like to refer to the first meaning, the idea that you are very fixed in place, as the receptive root, because it's usually used in connection with receiving the force of an opponent. Now, before I go any farther, I want you to know that I don't think any kind of concentration on being able to resist people's force has any real place in real Taijiquan. However, the condition under which you might be able to do that is important to understand. The fact is, you can have that condition where you're in a perfect place to be rooted, and that doesn't mean that you use it to resist force. You change from that, but you change in a much more intelligent way if you have found this particular kind of balance. Which leads me to another linguistic problem that you've got to solve, or at least understand. The word balance. The word balance is used in two completely different ways. It's used in terms of something that is, you see something that's like stable, a rock sitting somewhere, you say, well, that rock is balanced. Well, the rock is balanced because it has at least 3 points of contact with the ground or whatever, and moreover, the pressure on each one of those points is exactly the same. This is an important point to remember. Okay? But there's another kind of balance also. The balance that you see when you see a circus animal balance a ball on its nose. The first kind of balance that I discussed is completely associated with stability, absolute stability. And many people think of this as rootedness. Sure, of course, the more rooted you are, the more stable you are. However, the balance that we associate with the circus animal is completely associated with instability. Obviously, if he became stable for even a second, the ball would roll off his nose. He has to keep in constant motion, constant action. Now, we'll explain more about this as we go, but just accept for now the idea that we have a further problem, and that is that the word root is used in the same way by so-called hard boxers, or let's say kung fu or karate students, and Taiji students. And the usual use of it is as this kind of receptive root. Like, how do I receive an opponent's force and be strong about it? The sort of the kung fu karate concept is extremely stable. The Taiji concept is extremely unstable. So realize this, these are two completely different methods of achieving what both people call and can be interpreted as the same thing. Now, when we say also, now this relates to the problem of what we call double weight. When you think about it, double weight, which means your weight is equal on both feet, that's when you're the most stable. You say, oh, no, I can be stable if I, put more weight on the other leg. But notice if you put 100%, what do people do? They always kind of stick their toe out. You can have 100% weight and yet be kind of touching a wall or something, and then you say, I'm in perfect balance. But this is still, even though it's just a tiny bit of pressure, this is still enough to keep you from falling over. So this also explains one of the problems in the form, which I might mention now for your use. And that is when we say 100% weight on one foot, we would actually like to assume that you are not using any control from the unweighted foot to keep your balance. You'll discover when you use that external control, you can stay stable with just the large muscles of the body. They hold you up, and then you're sort of stabilized by this point. But if you completely give up any kind of dependence on this point, suddenly all of the small muscles of the body have to be brought into play, so that you actually are adjusting in a very, very fine way. And in fact, since the form is intended to constantly move, you really don't hold this position for any length of time. You just sort of pass through this 100% weight, and then you move on to the next leg. And you make some sort of change like this. So technically, it should not come up as a problem of stability. Now, then we get to the situation of tuisho. And this is where most students encounter the word root. Say, you should be rooted. They immediately assume that what root means, seems obvious, is that when the guy tries to push you, you don't let him push you. The fact that this violates one of the very most basic rules of Taiji, which is that you do not want pressure put on your body. You do not want a feather's weight to be put without changing. Somehow people seem to overlook that and say, that's just something else. And actually here, I want to be rooted. I want to show that I'm like very strong and so forth. So you've got to understand this condition is, what feels rooted in this stable way is not actually a product of double weight. It's a product of double pressure. In other words, when you have the same amount of pressure on each foot, that is when you feel the most stable. Like I say, the rock in the previous analogy, it has equal pressure on each place, and it also has equal weight on each place. But the rock doesn't have anything pushing on it. You might have something pushing on you. So what you are actually seeking to do is to distribute that push in terms of pressure so that it goes equally into both feet. This is the instinctive thing that any kind of child would do. And you can really make a case that the rootedness of Kung Fu and karate is just a very refined version of this. Now, if you are standing with your feet in a perfectly 90-degree angle to the force of the opponent, well, then double weight will correspond to double pressure. But suppose the opponent shifts to a more oblique angle. When he does, all of a sudden, if you keep your weight in the middle, you have more pressure on one side, the side away from the opponent. The only way to keep the pressure the same is to shift your weight towards that person. The more oblique the angle is, the more you shift your weight in order to equalize the pressure. Now, the first stance that we mentioned, where it's right angles, we call it a horse stance. The horse stance has a little more technical definition than that, but let's just call it that for the moment. That's a horse stance. As the angle shifts and you shift your weight in that direction, you progressively become more and more of an arrow stance. And these are usually presented as two different stances, but you can see that functionally speaking, they are the same. They're made to accomplish the same function, which is that whatever the case, you want the force to be distributed equally. Now, both of these stances are completely static. That is, they have nothing to do with the circus animal balancing the ball in its nose. There's no movement there. They are stable. They are static. The only time you change is if the angle of the force changes. As it moves, you might shift your weight closer to the center or away from the center. But still, you're shifting it to a place where then you want to be completely stable. You want to be completely fixed. Now, this is called double weight. You are, when you work in Taiji, you're constantly told not to be double weighted. Please don't be double weighted. You're double weighted. Stop being double weighted. And the only way it's possible to interpret this phrase is I have my weight equally distributed on both feet. In other words, they don't say stop being double pressured. That actually might be a little clearer. But either way, it's still a very confusing kind of instruction, because at the same time, they're telling you to resist someone's force. There's only, maybe there's more, but as far as I've been able to determine, there are only two ways to actually do this. One is this instinctive, perhaps well-trained or whatever, but it's the same, this double-weighted behavior. Double-weighted behavior produces this stable position in which you feel like you can receive force without moving. You're not told any other way to do it. So when you're not told any other way to do it, you're given this kind of weird conundrum. You're told, okay, resist this force, but don't be double-weighted. Now, the biggest mistake you can possibly make is to think that, okay, I can do this instinctive thing that feels like it resists the force, but by virtue of some sort of visualization or meditation or some sort of thing like this, I can somehow dignify this and make it something different from actually being double-weighted. I wouldn't blame anyone for having that impression. I think I got that impression at first. Like, wow, that's some mysterious thing I'm supposed to be doing. The technique of Taijiquan is not mysterious. It's not visualization. It's not meditation. It is a physical technique, but it's a very dynamic one. Like I say, it corresponds to the circus animal and the ball in his nose. And this is an extremely difficult thing to master. I've been teaching it for years, and even with my best and most developed teaching methods, I find that it takes students, an unreasonable time, if they're very talented, maybe 6 months, maybe a year, maybe a couple of years. But realistically, it's not easy to do because it involves the acquisition of a whole bunch of other skills other than this definition of what you're doing. Now, I call this particular skill making the air ball. I'll explain what that is later. And when I say later, I think we'll have to reserve a lot of this lecture for another lecture, and we can go on with this. But I want you to absorb this one fact, early. Like I say, all these weird linguistic confusions, and the fact that for these other boxing styles, double weight is not a mistake. Their teachers don't tell them stop being double weighted. Double weight is not, it's a method. It's a method they deliberately do. And the whole history of Taiji is very connected with Taiji masters teaching Taiji to people who've studied Kung Fu and other things before that, maybe for years. So they have this habit of being double weighted on purpose. So this is why you constantly got to stop being double weighted, stop being double weighted. You're still double weighted. Of course they're still double weighted. They've been trained to be that way. But as I say, it is also the only instinctive way that one can actually respond to this reception of force. So in the next lecture, I will explain the Taiji method.